I buried my wife on a Tuesday, and by Tuesday afternoon I was sitting in a folding chair in my dark suit, still smelling like the flowers from the funeral home, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I had already talked to more people that day than I usually talk to in a month, and I didn't have much left in me. But something made me pick it up, and a man's voice on the other end introduced himself as Richard Amos and said he was Eleanor's CEO. I had heard the name before in passing, the way you hear the names of people who matter to your spouse's life, but never quite become part of yours. He said he was sorry for my loss, and he sounded like he meant it, which surprised me because I had pictured someone colder. Then he said there was something in her office I needed to see, and that it couldn't wait, and that he would rather tell me in person than over the phone. I told him I had just buried my wife a few hours ago, and he said he knew, and that he wouldn't be calling if it wasn't important. There was something in the way he said it, careful and a little urgent at the same time, that made the hair on my arm stand up. Eleanor and I had been married for 31 years, and in all that time, I never once set foot in her actual office. I knew the building from the outside. I knew the parking garage. I knew the coffee shop across the street where she used to grab her afternoon coffee. But the office itself, the fourth floor, where she spent 40 hours a week for the better part of 2 decades, was a place I had never seen. She used to joke that it was boring in there, just spreadsheets and meetings, nothing a warehouse guy like me would want to sit through. I believed her, because why wouldn't I? We didn't lie to each other. At least that's what I always thought. I asked Richard if this could wait until next week, and he was quiet for a second too long before he answered. He said that legally, and for her sake it really couldn't. That word legally sat wrong in my stomach. I asked him what he meant by that, and he said he'd rather explain it to me in person, that it wasn't the kind of thing you said over the phone to a man who'd just come from a burial. I remember looking around my living room while he talked, at the casseroles the neighbors had dropped off, at Eleanor's reading glasses, still sitting on the side table where she'd left them a week ago, and I remember thinking that nothing about that day made any sense already. So what was one more thing that didn't make sense? I agreed to come in the next morning. After I hung up, I sat there for a long time, not moving, just turning the conversation over in my head. Eleanor and I told each other everything, or so I believed. She knew about the guys at the warehouse. She knew when Pete got passed over for the shift supervisor job and complained about it for a month straight. She knew every small thing that happened in my little corner of the world. But I realized, sitting there in that quiet house, that I couldn't have told you the name of a single person she worked with, other than Richard Amos, and I only knew that because he'd just called me. I didn't know what she did all day, besides sit in meetings and look at numbers. I told myself that was normal, that plenty of marriages worked that way, one person's job just being background noise to the other. But normal didn't explain why a company CEO was calling a grieving widower on the day of the funeral, insisting something in her office needed to be seen right away. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about small things, moments that hadn't meant anything to me before, but suddenly felt different. A few months back, Eleanor had started locking her home office door when she worked from the house on weekends, something she'd never done before. I'd knocked once to bring her a cup of coffee, and she'd opened the door just a crack, thanked me, and closed it again before I could even set the mug down properly. I remember feeling a small sting of hurt at the time, but I let it go, because that's what you do after 31 years. You let the small things go and trust that the big things are solid. I also remembered her coming home late 3 or 4 times in the last year, later than her usual schedule, and when I asked, she just said work was busy, budget season, year-end reports, the kind of vague answer that closes a conversation instead of opening one. I hadn't pushed. I trusted her completely. I still trusted her, even lying awake that night, even with my stomach twisted up over a phone call I didn't understand. But trust and confusion were sitting right next to each other in my chest, and I didn't know yet which one was going to win. The next morning I put on the same suit I'd worn to bury her, because it was the only suit I owned that still fit right, and I drove to the building I'd only ever seen from the outside. The lobby was bigger than I expected, all glass and quiet, with a security desk where a young woman looked up my name and told me Mr. Amos was expecting me. She said it gently, The way people talk to you when they already know why you're there, and they feel sorry about it. I rode the elevator up to the 4th floor by myself, and when the doors opened, I felt like I was walking into a part of my wife's life I'd never been invited into before, except now I was walking into it without her. Richard Amos met me at the elevator himself, which I hadn't expected from a man his position. He was older than his voice had sounded on the phone, gray at the temples with the kind of tired eyes that told me he hadn't slept much better than I had. He shook my hand and said again how sorry he was, and this time, seeing his face, I believed it even more. He walked me down a hallway past desks where people glanced up and then quickly looked back down at their screens. The way people do when they know a stranger walking through is someone else's grief made visible. We stopped at a door near the end of the hall with Eleanor's name still on a little plate beside it, and Richard hesitated before opening it, like he was giving me one last second to change my mind. The office was small and neat, exactly the way I would have pictured it if I'd ever let myself picture it. There was a framed photo of the two of us on her desk, one from a trip to the coast years back, and seeing it there, in a place I'd never been, hit me harder than I expected. Richard closed the door behind us and asked if I wanted to sit down, and something in the way he asked told me I probably should. He said that before he showed me anything, he needed me to know that Eleanor was one of the most honest people he had ever worked with, and that whatever I was about to see, he didn't want me walking away thinking otherwise. That kind of opening only makes a man more nervous, not less, and I told him so. He almost smiled, just for a second, like that was something Eleanor might have said too. He walked over to her desk and pulled out a drawer at the bottom that had a small lock on it already open. Inside was a plain gray folder, thick with paper, and beneath it, a small external hard drive with a strip of masking tape on top. On the tape, in Eleanor's handwriting, the same handwriting I'd seen on grocery lists and birthday cards for 31 years, were 3 words, "For Harold only." Seeing my own name written there in her hand, in a place she'd never once brought me, did something to me I wasn't ready for. My eyes went hot before I could stop them, and Richard had the decency to look away and give me a second. He told me that about 3 weeks before she passed, Eleanor had come to him privately, outside of normal business hours, and asked him to hold on to this drawer's key personally, not through HR, not through legal, just him. She'd told him that if anything ever happened to her, he was to make sure I got what was inside, and only me, and that he was not to look through it himself unless it became absolutely necessary. He said he'd respected that mostly, though he admitted he'd glanced at a few pages, enough to know this wasn't personal letters or old photographs. He said it was work-related, serious, and that he thought I deserved to know that before I opened it myself, alone, at home, without any warning, I asked him if he knew what it was about, and for the first time since I'd walked in, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. He said he had some idea, but that it wasn't his place to explain Eleanor's own investigation before I'd even had the chance to see her words for myself. Investigation. That word landed in the room like something breaking. I sat there holding a folder with my dead wife's handwriting on it, in an office I'd never seen, being told by a man I'd never met that my wife of 31 years had been conducting some kind of investigation I knew absolutely nothing about. And for the first time since the funeral, my grief had something else standing right next to it, sharp and unfamiliar, and I didn't yet have a name for what it was. I didn't open the folder there in the office. Richard offered me a private room down the hall, but I told him I needed to do this somewhere that felt like mine, not somewhere that still smelled like her perfume and her quiet absence. He didn't argue. He walked me back to the elevator, and just before the doors closed, he said one more thing, quiet, almost like he wasn't sure he should say it at all. He said that whatever I found in there, Eleanor hadn't done any of it for herself, and that I should remember that before I let myself think the worst. I didn't know what he meant by the worst yet, but the way he said it stayed with me the whole drive home, sitting there on the passenger seat next to the folder and the hard drive like a stranger riding along. I got home and sat at our kitchen table, the same table where Eleanor and I had eaten 10,000 dinners together, and I set the folder down in front of me for a long time before I could make myself open it. My hands weren't steady. I kept thinking about that word Richard used, investigation, and about the locked office door. and the late nights she'd explained away with 2 or 3 vague words. Part of me wanted to call one of our kids and ask them to come sit with me while I looked, but another part of me, the stubborn part that Eleanor used to tease me about, wanted to face it alone first, the way I'd faced most hard things in my life. When I finally opened the folder, the first page wasn't what I expected. It wasn't a letter to me. It was a printed email dated almost 3 years back, forwarded from an internal company account to Eleanor's private one. The subject line stripped down to nothing but a string of numbers. Underneath it, in her handwriting, she'd written a single note in the margin. This is where it started. I read that line 4 or 5 times before it settled into me, because it meant that whatever this was, it hadn't happened in the last few weeks or months. My wife had been carrying something for 3 years, sitting across from me at this same table, sleeping beside me every night, carrying a secret the size of 3 years, and never once letting it show on her face. I kept turning pages, and the deeper I went, the more it started to look less like a personal letter and more like a case file. The kind of thing you'd expect a lawyer or an investigator to put together, not an accounts manager at a mid-sized company. There were spreadsheets with certain rows highlighted in yellow, printouts of emails with names blacked out except for initials, and handwritten notes in the margins that read, like she was talking herself through something complicated, working out a puzzle one piece at a time. One note said, "If I'm right about this, someone is going to lose everything, and it might not be the person who deserves to." I read that line twice, and something cold moved through my chest, because it sounded like my wife had spent years worried not about protecting herself, but about protecting someone else, someone who might get blamed for whatever she'd uncovered. About halfway through the folder, I found a name that kept appearing again and again, a name I had never once heard Eleanor mention at our dinner table in all our years together. Priya Nandan. The name showed up in Eleanor's handwriting more than any other, sometimes just the first name, underlined. Like Eleanor had been keeping a private eye on this person, the way you watch out for somebody you're worried about. There was a sticky note stuck to one page, half peeling off, and on it Eleanor had written, "She doesn't know yet. Don't let this land on her." I sat with that sentence for a long time. My wife, on top of whatever she was investigating, had apparently spent real energy trying to shield a young woman I'd never heard of from something Eleanor believed was coming. I reached for the hard drive next, turning it over in my hands, feeling the weight of it, wondering what else was locked inside beyond paper. I didn't have the right cable to plug it into anything in the house, and for a moment I just sat there holding it, feeling foolish and helpless in a way I wasn't used to feeling. 40 years on a warehouse floor teaches you how to fix almost anything with your hands, but nothing had prepared me for a small metal drive that might hold the last 3 years of my wife's hidden life. I thought about calling Richard back, or maybe our son, who was better with computers than I'd ever be, but something held me back. Eleanor had written for Harold only on that tape, not for Harold and whoever he brings in to help. Whatever this was, she'd wanted it to start with me and only me, and I owed her that much before I let anyone else in. I set the hard drive down next to the folder and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, at the bird feeder Eleanor used to keep filled every single week without fail, empty now because I hadn't thought to refill it. The house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming from the next room. I thought about the woman I had married, the woman who clipped coupons and laughed at bad sitcoms and fell asleep every night with a book open on her chest, and I tried to fit her into the picture forming on my kitchen table. A woman quietly building a case against something or someone at her own company, protecting a stranger I'd never met, carrying all of it alone for 3 years without a single crack showing in the life we shared. I didn't feel angry yet, not exactly. What I felt was smaller and stranger than anger. Something closer to grief opening a second door I hadn't known was there, and behind it I was starting to understand was a version of my wife I had never fully met. The next morning I called Ben Okafor. He was the grandson of an old friend of mine, a man named Samuel Okafor, who used to work the loading dock 2 shifts over from mine back in the 80s, before Samuel retired and eventually passed on himself a few years back. Ben had grown into a paralegal, sharp as anything, and he'd always had a soft spot for me, the way young people sometimes do, for the older folks who knew their grandparents before they did. I hadn't planned on calling him. I hadn't planned on calling anyone. But sitting alone with that folder for a second night in a row, feeling like I was drowning in something I didn't have the tools to understand, I finally admitted to myself that I needed somebody who knew how to read a case file the way I knew how to read a torque wrench. Ben came over that evening, still in his work clothes, a young man in his late 20s with tired eyes and a gentleness about him that reminded me of his grandfather. I told him everything, or as much as I understood of everything, and I watched his face change as I laid the pages out across the kitchen table in the order I'd found them. He didn't say much at first. He just read slowly, occasionally going back a page or two, occasionally letting out a breath through his nose the way people do when something is starting to make sense to them in a way they don't like. When he finally looked up at me, he asked if he could take some of it home to look over more carefully, and something in the careful way he asked told me he'd already seen enough to be worried. Before he left, he explained what he could. He said what I was looking at resembled the kind of paper trail someone builds when they suspect financial misconduct at a company, the sort of documentation meant to hold up if it ever needed to go in front of auditors or lawyers. He pointed at the highlighted spreadsheet rows and told me they looked like discrepancies, numbers that didn't match between two different sets of company records. The kind of thing that either meant an honest mistake or something being deliberately hidden, he said. The blacked out names with initials only were a red flag, too, because it meant Eleanor had been protecting the identities of people involved, maybe out of fairness, maybe out of fear that the wrong person would end up blamed before the truth came out. I asked him about Priya Nandan, and Ben went quiet for a second, flipping back to that sticky note that read, "She doesn't know yet. Don't let this land on her." He said if he had to guess, based on the pattern he was seeing, Priya was probably a junior employee whose name kept showing up near the discrepancies, someone whose signature or approval might be tied to the numbers that didn't add up, whether or not she actually understood what she was signing off on. He said in his experience, that was often exactly how these things worked. The people at the bottom get their names attached to decisions made higher up, and when something eventually breaks open, they're the easiest ones to blame, because they don't have the position or the resources to defend themselves the way the people above them do. That explanation sat heavy in my chest. I thought about my wife, sitting in that fourth-floor office, watching this unfold in slow motion for 3 years, and choosing again and again not to walk away from it, not to look the other way the way plenty of people would have, especially so close to retirement, especially with nothing forcing her hand. She could have let it go. She could have kept her head down, finished out her career quietly, and none of this would ever have found its way to my kitchen table. Instead, she'd spent 3 years building a case to protect a young woman she apparently barely knew personally, at what I was starting to realize might have been real risk to herself. Ben asked me gently if Eleanor had ever seemed stressed, distracted, different in the last few years, and I sat there trying to remember, really remember, instead of just accepting the surface explanations I'd given myself at the time. The late nights, the locked office door, the vague answers about budget season. A few times she'd gotten a phone call at odd hours and stepped outside to take it, something she'd never done before in all our years together. I'd noticed all of it, in pieces, and I'd let every piece slide past me because I trusted her completely and never once thought to ask what she might be carrying that she couldn't set down in front of me. Ben must have seen something shift in my face, because he reached over and put a hand on my shoulder, the same easy, respectful gesture his grandfather used to use on the dock when a younger guy was struggling with something heavy. Before he left that night, Ben told me something that stuck with me long after his car pulled out of the driveway. He said that in his experience, when someone builds a file, this careful, this thorough over this many years, they're not doing it because they're paranoid or because they enjoy stirring up trouble. They're doing it because they believe deep down that if they don't, nobody else will, and someone innocent is going to pay the price for somebody else's greed. He said that sounded like exactly the kind of person his grandfather used to talk about, people who quietly carried more weight than anybody around them ever realized, because they'd rather bear it alone than let it land on somebody who couldn't afford to. I sat at that table long after he'd gone, looking at the empty chair where Eleanor used to sit, and for the first time since the funeral, what I felt wasn't only grief. It was something closer to pride, tangled up so tightly with guilt that I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began, because the woman I'd shared a bed with for 31 years had been quietly carrying the weight of somebody else's future, and I hadn't even noticed her back bending under it. 2 days later, I decided I needed to see Priya Nandan for myself. Ben advised against it at first, told me it might be smarter to let a lawyer make first contact, someone who knew how to handle these things properly. But I told him the same thing I'd been telling myself since I opened that folder. Eleanor hadn't left that file with a law firm, she'd left it with me. Whatever she wanted done with it, she'd trusted my hands to do it, not someone else's, and I wasn't ready to hand the whole thing over to a stranger with a briefcase before I even understood what I was protecting. Ben respected that, though I could see it cost him something to let me do it my own way. He gave me Priya's work email, the only contact information he could find without digging in ways that might draw attention, and told me to keep it simple, keep it calm, and not to mention the file by name until I understood how much she already knew. I sat at that kitchen table for the better part of an hour, trying to write an email to a woman I'd never met, a woman my wife had spent 3 years quietly protecting. I must have started that message 5 or 6 times before I settled on something honest and plain. I told her my name, told her I was Eleanor Vance's husband, and asked if she might have a little time to talk, whenever it suited her, about nothing urgent, just something Eleanor had wanted me to pass along. I didn't want to scare her. I didn't want to open a door faster than she was ready to walk through it. I hit send before I could second-guess myself any further, and then I sat there most of that evening, checking my phone every few minutes like a man waiting on test results. She wrote back the next morning, and I could feel the caution in every line of it, the careful way people write when they're not sure what a conversation is going to cost them. She said she was so sorry for my loss, that Eleanor had been kind to her, more than kind, and that she'd wondered, since hearing the news, whether she'd ever get the chance to properly thank her for everything. That last part caught in my chest. Everything. She agreed to meet me for coffee that Thursday at a small place not far from the office, the same coffee shop I realized with a strange ache that Eleanor used to visit most afternoons. Priya turned out to be younger than I expected, maybe 26 or 27, with the kind of nervous energy of someone who'd learned to watch her own words carefully. She thanked me again for meeting her, and then, almost immediately, she started talking about Eleanor, unprompted, like she'd been carrying things she needed to say to somebody, and I happened to be the first person who gave her the opening. She told me Eleanor used to check in on her sometimes, quiet conversations in the break room, nothing that ever felt strange at the time, just an older woman being kind to someone new. It wasn't until the last year, she said, that she started to feel like there was more behind those conversations than simple kindness. Though she couldn't have told you exactly what, I asked her, as gently as I knew how. If the name Douglas Ferris meant anything to her. Her face changed the second I said it, some careful mask slipping just slightly before she pulled it back into place. She said he was the finance director, her boss, 2 levels up, a man everyone respected and nobody crossed. She said it, the way you talk about weather you can't control, something you just learn to work around. I told her, without going into specifics, that Eleanor had left behind some paperwork, some concerns she'd apparently been documenting for a while, and that Priya's name had come up in connection with it. I watched the color drain slightly from her face, and for a moment I thought I'd made a mistake, moved too fast, said too much too soon. She was quiet for a long moment, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table, and then she told me something I hadn't expected. About 1.5 years ago, Douglas had asked her to sign off on a batch of numbers during a busy closing period, told her it was routine, told her everyone in her position did it without a second thought. She said she'd trusted him, because why wouldn't she? He was senior, respected, and she was new enough that questioning him felt like questioning the whole structure she was trying to build a career inside of. She said a few weeks later, Eleanor had pulled her aside, quietly, and asked her a handful of careful questions about that closing period. Nothing accusatory, just curious. The kind of questions that seemed harmless in the moment, but that Priya had thought about many times since. I asked her if she understood now what those numbers had actually been. She shook her head slowly and said she still wasn't entirely sure, only that something about the memory of that day had never sat right with her, and that she'd never had the courage, or maybe the standing, to ask anyone above her what it really meant. She looked at me then, with an expression somewhere between fear and relief, and asked if I thought she was in trouble. I didn't have an honest answer for her yet, not really, but I thought about that sticky note in Eleanor's careful handwriting. She doesn't know yet. Don't let this land on her. And I told Priya the only true thing I could offer in that moment. I told her that whatever this turned out to be, my wife had spent 3 years working to make sure it didn't land on her, and that I intended to finish what Eleanor started, one way or another, so that promise didn't die along with her. Ben called me 2 days after the meeting with Priya, and I could hear something different in his voice right away, tighter, more careful than before. He'd spent the weekend going through the rest of the documents I'd given him, cross-referencing dates and names as best he could without official access to company records, and he told me he needed to come by in person rather than explain it over the phone. When he showed up that evening, he had a legal pad covered in his own handwriting, arrows connecting one note to another, the kind of working document that told me he'd been at this a long time without stopping. He laid it out for me as plainly as he could. Based on what Eleanor had documented, it looked like Douglas Ferris had been quietly moving numbers around during specific closing periods over several years, small enough each time to avoid drawing attention from auditors, but large enough, added up, to represent a serious sum, he said, the pattern suggested. Ferris had been using lower-level employees like Priya to formally sign off on batches of numbers during the busiest, most chaotic weeks of the quarter, when nobody had the time or the standing to ask too many questions. If it ever came to light, the signatures on those documents would belong to people like Priya, not to Douglas Ferris himself. And that was, Ben said grimly, probably the entire point. I asked him the question that had been sitting in my chest since that first night at the kitchen table. I asked him what Eleanor's role in all this actually was, whether she had any authority to have stopped it outright instead of building a case quietly on her own for 3 years. Ben explained that from what he could tell, Eleanor's position gave her access to the numbers and the ability to notice the discrepancies, but not the authority to act on her own, not without solid proof that could withstand scrutiny, especially not against someone as senior and well-connected as Ferris. He said if she'd gone to leadership too early without an airtight case, she risked being dismissed, or worse, risked tipping Ferris off before there was enough evidence to actually stop him, giving him time to cover his tracks even further and shift more blame downward onto people like Priya. That explanation helped me understand something I'd been struggling with since I first opened that folder. Eleanor hadn't been reckless, and she hadn't been paranoid. She'd been patient, methodical, careful in exactly the way she was careful about everything in her life, the way she'd double-check a grocery list or read the fine print on an insurance policy twice before signing. She'd been building something that could actually hold up brick by brick over years, because she understood that a case built too fast, out of anger or urgency, could collapse and take an innocent person down with it. It was so much like her, I realized, sitting there at that table, that I felt a small, aching flash of the woman I loved rising up out of all this confusion, solid and recognizable again. But Ben also had harder news. He said that Richard Amos, the CEO who'd handed me the folder, likely knew more than he'd let on in our first meeting, and that if this went any further, I'd need to have a much more direct conversation with him, one that might put both of us in an uncomfortable position, depending on how deep Richard's own knowledge went. He also warned me that once we started asking more formal questions, moving beyond quiet conversations over coffee, word would eventually get back to Douglas Ferris, if it hadn't already in some smaller way. A man who'd been careful enough to build this scheme over years wouldn't sit quietly once he sensed someone was closing in, especially not a grieving widower with nothing left to lose and a paralegal grandson of an old friend helping him along the way. That night, after Ben left, I sat alone in the house for a long time, looking at the folder now organized into neat sections on my kitchen table, Ben's notes stacked carefully beside Eleanor's original pages. I thought about the last few months of her life differently now, replaying dinners where she'd seemed tired, moments where she'd stared out the window a little too long before answering a simple question, and I understood now that she'd been carrying the weight of exactly this, calculating risk, protecting a young woman she barely knew, trying to time everything so that the truth would come out clean, without collateral damage. I thought about Richard's words in the elevator that whatever I found, Eleanor hadn't done any of it for herself, and for the first time, I let myself feel proud instead of just confused, even as a small, cold thread of fear settled into my chest at the thought of what might happen. Once Douglas Ferris realized someone was picking up exactly where Eleanor Vance had left off. I called Richard Amos myself the following morning, and I could hear a small note of relief in his voice when I told him I wanted to talk again, like he'd been waiting for that call without wanting to push me before I was ready. We met at a diner a few blocks from the office instead of his building, his choice, and I understood why the moment we sat down. He wanted somewhere without cameras in the hallway, without assistants who might mention to the wrong person that the CEO had spent an hour with a grieving widower for the second time in 2 weeks. He didn't waste time once the coffee arrived. He told me that about 8 months ago, Eleanor had come to him with a small piece of what she'd found, not the whole picture, just enough to test whether he was someone she could trust with the rest eventually. He said she'd been careful, almost clinical, laying out a narrow slice of the discrepancies without naming names, watching his reaction closely before deciding how much further to go. He admitted that at the time he'd been cautious himself, not because he doubted her, but because an accusation like that, even a partial one, aimed anywhere near Douglas Ferris, could shake the whole company if it wasn't handled exactly right. Ferris had been there longer than Richard had relationships with board members that predated Richard's own hiring, and Richard said plainly that he'd needed to be sure before he moved on anything that's serious. I asked him directly if he'd known about Priya, about the plan Eleanor seemed to have to protect her, and something in his face told me the answer before he said it out loud. He said Eleanor had mentioned a junior employee once, careful not to use a name, and had told him clearly that whatever happened, whoever ended up responsible, she didn't want the fallout landing on someone who'd simply done what she was told by a superior she had every reason to trust. He said Eleanor had made him promise, informally, sitting in his office with the door closed, that if anything ever happened to her before she finished what she'd started, he would make sure the file found its way to someone who would finish it the right way, protecting the same people she'd been protecting all along. That was when Richard told me something that changed the shape of everything sitting in my chest. He said, Eleanor hadn't been planning to bring this forward alone at all. She'd been working quietly toward a specific date just under 2 months away, when the company's annual external audit was scheduled to begin, an audit conducted by an outside firm with no loyalty to anyone inside the building, including Ferris. She'd wanted to have her case complete and airtight before then, so that when the auditors came in, the discrepancies she'd already mapped out would line up with what they found on their own, giving her documentation the kind of independent confirmation that would be almost impossible to dismiss or bury. She hadn't been planning to blow anything up herself. She'd been planning to hand the auditors a map before they even knew they needed one. I sat with that for a long moment, staring down at my coffee, feeling something shift inside me that I didn't fully have words for yet. My wife hadn't just been documenting a problem out of anger or suspicion. She'd been engineering a moment, patiently, over years, time to arrive at exactly the point where the truth would be undeniable, and the people responsible for protecting it would have no choice but to listen. She died 2 months before that audit date, before she could see the plan through to its natural end. And now here I was, sitting in a diner with her boss, holding the pieces of something she'd never gotten to finish. Richard leaned forward and told me, quietly enough that I had to lean in to hear him over the clatter of the diner, that the audit date hadn't changed. It was still coming, 7 weeks out now, and it would happen whether or not anyone finished what Eleanor started. He said, if the documentation she'd left behind was as thorough as it sounded, there was still time to make sure it reached the right hands before the auditors arrived. Still time to finish building the case the way she'd intended, so that when the truth surfaced, it surfaced clean, with the right person held responsible and the wrong person protected, exactly the way Eleanor had fought so hard to protect her. He looked at me across that table, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I understood clearly what my next 7 weeks were going to look like, and I understood, with a certainty that surprised me, that I wasn't going to let that deadline pass without finishing what my wife had spent the last 3 years of her life quietly building toward. The 7 weeks that followed felt different from anything I'd lived through before. Even different from the grief itself, which had settled into something I carried alongside everything else, instead of something that stopped me cold every morning. Ben came by 2 or 3 evenings a week after his regular job ended, still in his work clothes, and together we built out a timeline on a sheet of poster board I'd bought at the drugstore, taping it to the wall of what used to be Eleanor's sewing room, a space neither of our kids had wanted to touch since she passed. We filled it with dates, discrepancies, initials that Ben slowly matched to real names using old company directories, and a careful process of comparing handwriting and signature patterns against the documents Eleanor had gathered. Priya became part of it too, cautiously at first, and then with a kind of quiet determination that reminded me, in a way that ached, of Eleanor herself. She started keeping her own careful notes about small things she remembered, conversations she'd half forgotten until she really sat and thought them through, emails Ferris had sent her that she'd deleted at the time without a second thought, because they'd seemed so routine. She found 2 of them still sitting in an old backup folder on a work laptop she'd been issued years ago and never fully wiped, and when she forwarded them to Ben, he called me almost immediately, his voice tight with something between excitement and disbelief. Those emails, dated years back, showed Ferris instructing her explicitly on how to categorize a batch of numbers in a way that, read plainly, looked exactly like what Eleanor had suspected all along. But it wasn't only good news during those weeks. About a month in, Richard called me, sounding rattled in a way I hadn't heard from him before. He told me Douglas Ferris had asked him, seemingly out of nowhere, whether anyone had been in Eleanor's old office since she passed, whether her personal files had been cleared out yet, whether there was anything of hers still sitting around that HR should probably collect and dispose of properly. Richard said he'd kept his face neutral and told Ferris that everything had already been handled, but he warned me that the question itself meant something. Ferris was starting to wonder, maybe not with any real evidence yet, but with the kind of instinct a man like that develops after years of watching his own back, whether Eleanor had left something behind that hadn't stayed buried with her. That news put a different kind of pressure on all of us. Ben started being more careful about where we met and what he carried with him, choosing coffee shops on the other side of town instead of anywhere near the office, backing up copies of everything onto a drive he kept at his own apartment instead of leaving anything solely in my house. Priya grew quieter for a few days after Richard's warning reached her too, and I worried I'd pulled her into something that might cost her the career she'd worked so hard to build. I told her, sitting across from her at that same coffee shop where we'd first talked, that if she wanted to step back, no one would think less of her, that Eleanor herself would never have wanted her to carry more risk than she could bear. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said something I've thought about many times since. She said Eleanor had spent 3 years carrying this so it wouldn't fall on her, and she wasn't about to let that sacrifice mean nothing, just because it got a little frightening near the end. Around the 5th week, we hit a problem we hadn't fully planned for. Ben explained that even with everything we'd gathered, presenting it directly to the board or to the auditors ourselves, as outsiders, with no official standing inside the company, could get the whole thing dismissed as the grieving, possibly overzealous actions of a widower and a young employee with something to prove. We needed someone inside the company, someone with real authority, willing to formally flag the concerns before the auditors arrived, so that the documentation would be treated as a legitimate internal finding rather than an outside accusation that could be waved away or buried in procedure. There was only one person positioned to do that safely, and it meant Richard Amos would have to stop being merely a sympathetic bystander holding a locked drawer and start becoming something far more exposed, a CEO willing to formally challenge his own finance director 2 weeks before an audit based on evidence assembled by a dead woman, her husband, a paralegal, and a junior accountant who'd been quietly gathering courage for weeks. When I called Richard that night and asked if he was willing to take that step, there was a long silence on the line before he finally answered, and in that silence I heard a man weighing exactly how much he was willing to risk to finish what Eleanor Vance had started. Richard's answer, when it finally came, was quieter than I expected from a man who ran a company. He said yes, but he said it the way people agree to something they know is going to cost them, not the way people agree to something easy. He told me he'd spent 8 months half convinced Eleanor was right and half afraid of what it would mean for the company, for the board, for his own position, if he moved against a man as entrenched as Farrah Ellis and turned out to be wrong. He said, watching me show up at his office in a funeral suit, had settled something in him that 8 months of Eleanor's careful hints never quite had. He wasn't going to let her have carried this alone for 3 years, only to have it die quietly, because the people left behind were too frightened to finish it. We spent the 6th week preparing the formal presentation Richard would need, organizing Eleanor's original documentation alongside Ben's cross-referencing, and the 2 emails Priya had recovered, building it into something clean enough that a board member or an outside auditor could follow the trail without needing anyone to explain it out loud. Ben insisted on triple-checking every date against company fiscal calendars, worried that a single error, one wrong quarter, or mismatched figure could give Ferris an opening to discredit the entire file. Priya spent hours after her regular shift going through her memory of that closing period again and again, adding small details that on their own meant nothing but together painted a picture no honest person could easily explain away. It was during that 6th week that things nearly went wrong. Priya called me late one evening, her voice thin and frightened in a way I hadn't heard from her before. Ferris had stopped by her desk that afternoon, casual, almost friendly, and mentioned that he'd heard she'd been asking around about old closing procedures, wondering out loud if she was thinking about moving into a more senior role somewhere and brushing up on old files. He'd smiled the whole time, she said, which somehow made it worse than if he'd been openly angry. She said it felt like a warning wrapped up as a compliment. The kind of thing a man says when he wants you to know he's watching, without giving you anything you could ever repeat to someone else as a threat. That call kept me up most of the night. I thought about calling the whole thing off, telling Ben we needed to slow down, telling Priya she should step back before it cost her something. Eleanor never would have wanted her to pay. But then I thought about that sticky note again. Eleanor's handwriting, careful and certain. She doesn't know yet. Don't let this land on her. And I understood that stopping now, out of fear, would be its own kind of failure. A betrayal of exactly what my wife had spent 3 years trying to prevent. If we backed off and Ferris sensed weakness, he'd have time to clean up whatever trail remained. And Priya would still be the name attached to the numbers, whether we finished the fight or not. Slowing down wasn't safety. It was just a slower way of losing. I called Richard the next morning and told him what had happened, and his voice went hard in a way I hadn't heard from him before, the voice I imagined of a man remembering exactly why he'd agreed to this in the first place. He said we needed to move up the timeline, that waiting the full 2 remaining weeks gave Ferris too much room to maneuver, especially if he was already circling Priya directly. He told me he'd requested an emergency session with 2 trusted board members, the audit committee chair and the company's longest-serving independent director, for 3 days from then, using the excuse of a routine pre-audit compliance review, careful language chosen specifically so it wouldn't reach Ferris's ears before we were ready. Those 3 days felt longer than the previous 6 weeks combined. I barely slept, running through every piece of the file in my head, worried we'd missed something, worried Ferris would find some way to get ahead of us before the meeting even started. Ben stayed at my house most of the second night, going over the presentation one more time by lamplight in what used to be Eleanor's sewing room, the poster board covered in our timeline, staring down at both of us, like a map of everything my wife had carried silently for 3 years. Priya sent me a short message the night before the meeting, just a few lines, saying that whatever happened, she wanted me to know. She finally understood fully what Eleanor had been trying to protect her from all that time, and that she was ready to stand behind every word in that file if it came down to it. Reading that message, sitting alone in my kitchen at nearly midnight, I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsteady since the day Richard first called me, a certainty that whatever happened in that boardroom the next morning, we were finally standing exactly where Eleanor had always intended us to stand, ready to finish what she started. The boardroom was smaller than I expected, just a long table and a wall of windows looking out over the parking garage where Eleanor used to leave her car every single morning for 20 years. Richard had arranged for me to sit in as Eleanor's next of kin, technically there to formally hand over documentation that legally belonged to her estate, though everyone in that room understood I was there for more than paperwork. Ben sat beside me with a folder of his own, and Priya sat across the table, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that I could see the white in her knuckles, but her chin was up, and she didn't look away from anyone. The audit committee chair, a sharp-eyed woman named Constance Bird, who'd been with the company almost as long as Ferris himself, went through the documentation page by page without much expression on her face, occasionally asking Ben a precise question that he answered clearly and without hesitation. When she reached the 2 recovered emails from Priya's old backup folder, she read them twice, slowly, and then set them down flat on the table in front of her, with a stillness that told me more than any reaction would have. She asked Priya directly, gently, but without softening the question, whether she was prepared to formally confirm the origin and context of those emails if it came to that, and Priya, in a voice steadier than I'd heard from her in weeks, said yes without a single moment of hesitation. Ferris was called in an hour later, and I wasn't in the room for that part, but Richard told me afterward, sitting once more in that same quiet diner, how it had gone. He said Ferris had tried denial first, then irritation, then, when Constance laid Eleanor's 3 years of documentation next to his own signature on the original closing approvals, something in him seemed to fold inward all at once, like a man who'd spent so long believing he'd covered every angle that he'd never truly prepared for the day someone actually caught up to him. "Richard," said Ferris, asked almost quietly, how long Eleanor had known, and when Richard told him 3 years, Ferris just sat there for a long moment, saying nothing at all. The official audit 2 weeks later confirmed everything Eleanor had mapped out almost to the dollar, and it moved faster than anyone expected once the outside auditors had her documentation as a starting point instead of a blank slate. Ferris resigned before the findings were even finalized, avoiding, I was told, a more public unraveling that would have followed if he'd tried to fight it. Priya was never implicated in anything. If anything, her willingness to come forward with the emails and her memory of that closing period was noted formally in the audit report as evidence of good faith, and within a few months she was moved into a role with more responsibility, and, for the first time since I'd met her, she told me over coffee that she finally felt like she could breathe at that company without watching her own shadow. I went back to Eleanor's grave about a week after the audit closed, on a quiet Tuesday morning, much like the one I'd buried her on months before, except this time the flowers were mine, not the funeral home's, small ones from our own backyard, the same kind she used to fill vases with every spring. I sat there for a long while, telling her, out loud, the way I imagine plenty of grieving husbands do, even when they feel foolish doing it, that we'd finished it, all of it, exactly the way she'd planned, and that Priya was safe, and that Ferris was gone, and that Richard had kept every promise he'd made her in that closed-door office 8 months before she passed. I told her I was sorry it took me 31 years of marriage to finally understand the size of what she carried, without ever once asking me to help her carry it, and that I wished, more than almost anything, that she'd trusted me with it sooner, not because I doubted her, but because I would have given anything to stand beside her for those 3 long years instead of only these last 7 weeks. I still don't fully understand every part of who Eleanor was during those years she kept from me. The version of her that sat in boardrooms and studied spreadsheets late into the night and made quiet promises to protect a stranger without ever once mentioning it at our own dinner table. But I've come to believe that loving someone for 31 years doesn't mean knowing every single thing they carry. Sometimes it means trusting that whatever they're carrying it the way they always carried everything, quietly, carefully, and for the sake of someone who needed protecting more than they needed credit. I go by that coffee shop across from her old building sometimes now, not because I need to, but because it feels like the closest thing I have left to walking beside her through the parts of her life I never got to see while she was living it. And somewhere in that walk, I've finally started to understand that the woman I buried that Tuesday wasn't only my wife of 31 years. She was also quietly and without ever asking for recognition, exactly the kind of person worth being proud of long after she was gone.